Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Can comic books and science fiction turn your business around? Don't answer and don't laugh until you hear what Nathan Furr has to say. Nathan, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Nathan, you are an author of a book called Leading Transformation. And can you tell us, first of all, what is that word transformation? To me, it means change or something different. But is that the correct understanding in the business setting? How do you define it?
Yeah, I think obviously transformation means change, but the spirit with which we're talking about it is really big change. So, in essence, we want to say, how do you see what else is possible for your business or for your life and take meaningful action on that? And although we want to make that big change happen, we think about making it in smaller steps. So we often like to say little T transformations that lead to a big T transformation.
And I think you mentioned in your book, you urge people to dream bigger, then do something to bring it about. Even in business, do the real business people tend to think too small?
Oh, all the time. It's incredible. I mean, really, to be honest with you, the motivation for the book is that, listen, the barriers to change and transformation for organizations and people are the same because organizations are made up of people, and those problems are as old as the hills. And if you look at and talk to we're really motivated by behavioral science, that, the work that's been done in the last few decades. And the behavioral scientists have come up with lists and lists of biases and traps and so forth. But if we boil it down, it really comes down to three things that hold us back. Number one is the tendency to just see what's around us every day, to get stuck in the status quo, to me. So getting stuck in the status quo, number one. Number two is the habits and routines that we fall back on that keep us from changing. And number three is the fear of doing something new, the fear of the unknown. So what we did in this book was really to try to ask, well, could we design tools that could help people and organizations overcome this, getting stuck in the status quo, getting stuck in their routines, and the fear of the unknown?
Well, Nathan, I want our audience to know that, as I said to you before the show, we get a lot of books to review for the Secrets of Success. We've been on 30 years now. And I was reviewing about 15 or 20 new books, and yours is the only one that got a sticky that said, wow, get this guy on the show. So I think our audience is going to see some amazing things as you tell us what goes on. But I'd like you to tell us, just as the book starts, you talk about Lowe's stores and something they were doing. And I think that will kind of take us into the picture and get us to understand what leading transformation is about.
Yeah, for sure. So if you look, about 5 years ago, say 2012, Lowe's, the hardware retailer, was in a very familiar position for most companies. They're profitable, so they're in a good spot. They're number two in their industry. They're a public company in this case, so they have quarterly earnings pressure, and their market's pretty saturated. So given that kind of pressure, we probably would not predict that a lot is going to change, And that's the classic situation. I always have executives coming to me. I'm a professor at INSEAD. They're always coming to me and saying, I want to make change, but, the problem is we're comfortable. And so we think of that situation in 2012, then fast forward to today, and it's a totally different picture. They have robots in stores taking inventory. They're using, augmented reality and virtual reality to help people envision their remodels or to train them on how to do, a renovation. They have put the first store in space. They, sold one of the first augmented reality phones, and it sold out in 4 days with no marketing. They're building exosuits, so external robotic skeletons that help workers to lift, a heavy bucket of paint or something like that. And so that's a pretty radical change. And so the question is, wow, how did they break out of the doldrums of the everyday and then make some meaningful progress towards that? And so really part of what we write about in the book is that story, but we're writing about the principles by which they did it and how we've applied it in other situations, including where there's no technology involved. So, for example, at Pepsi, no technology there, but still, helping people to see what's possible and then make meaningful progress towards it.
Now, you mentioned two terms that probably most of us aren't familiar with, so I'm going to ask you if you could define them. What is augmented reality in your book that's just known as AR, and what is virtual reality, or as you call it, VR?
Yeah, for sure. So these are one among many of the kind of technologies that we classify as fourth industrial revolution technologies. And augmented reality is where you take a digital image and you superimpose it on your physical world. So imagine, this was the concept behind Google Glass, where you put on glasses and then it imposes a digital image onto your physical world. Whereas virtual reality is where you put on like a headset and you're immersed into a virtual world. So if you think of like a Google Cardboard or an Oculus Rift, these are products that use this technology where you're literally putting on a headset and it looks like you're in this other world that's obviously digitally created.
So we could go into Lowe's, and within a few seconds, we're probably going to be what we consider a science fiction magazine or a movie theater where we're taken into the future by one of these devices with augmented reality or virtual reality. And yet we're going to like it because I know the outcome of your book, and it's going to show us new things we can do with our home, how it would look with our home, how it would blend in. Do I have the gist of it?
Absolutely. So actually, my co-author, Kyle Nell, was head of innovation at Lowe's, and he worked on this project. And, what we found out is we actually tested both technologies, and we ultimately ended up settling on augmented reality. And the idea here is that you can, literally take your phone, you could point it at your room, and then you could start to say, well, what would it look like if I put this refrigerator in here? Or what would it look like if I changed the paint color? So that's the kind of choices that it gives you.
Now, we want to find out more because I mentioned at the beginning of the show something about science fiction and comic books, but I want you to get into that, and I want you to tell us that part of it. But before we move ahead, I want our audience to know that they're listening to The Secrets of Success. Today we're talking to Nathan Furr, F-U-R-R. He's the author of the book Leading Transformation. And Nathan, where can we get the book, and is there a website where we can find out more? Because I think more and more as our audience listens, they're going to become more and more interested in this topic.
Yeah, so you can go to the website, leadingtransformationbook.com. That's B-O-O-K. Or you can go to Amazon.com and buy it from Amazon. It is published by Harvard Business Review Press, so we're very excited about that because they only publish about 15 books a year. So that's like to have made that bar, we feel really happy about. But Amazon.com is probably your best price there.
And as we always tell our audience, first of all, if you want to stand out from the crowd and kind of let people know that you know what's coming in the future, and at first they might say, oh, you're crazy, and then they're going to say, wait, we just read about that. We just saw this in a store. Tell them about the book, Leading Transformation. It's almost like an adventure novel as you read it because it's kind of so amazing. Now, Nathan, where did comic books and science fiction come into this picture? This sounds certainly advanced, but what about the science fiction part?
For sure. So first, as a little bit of background, I'm a professor at INSEAD. You could think of it as the Harvard of Europe. We have campuses in France, Singapore, and Abu Dhabi. And one of the things I do is try to understand how does innovation happen? How does change happen? And I've been really curious about how do we apply what we call the behavioral sciences, so this is psychology and cognition and neuroscience, to address the limits that hold us back. And as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the big limitations that we all face is what's known as local thinking or getting stuck in the status quo. We tend to see only the things that are nearby, and we fail to see the possibilities that are just outside the fence of the status quo. So every once in a while, and you know this, you've had that moment where maybe you were talking to a really visionary friend where you say, oh my gosh, my life could be totally different. And the same is true of organizations. And so what we're looking for is what are the tools that would help organizations and individuals overcome that tendency to get stuck in local thinking in the status quo. And one of the tools we came up with was science fiction. Because what do science fiction writers do? They envision the future in human terms. They help us see what else is possible. Now, it's not the only tool that you can use. We talk, for example, we have an article coming out in Harvard Business Review Press where we talk about using analogies or first principles thinking or, exaptation, all these cool tools. But really, science fiction is maybe the one. And what it involves what we did, for example, at Lowe's, is we gave the data we had around customer trends and technology trends to a panel of science fiction writers. And we had them write stories about what the future could look like in 5 to 10 years with a customer problem at the center. And what came back to us was remarkable in terms of its convergence. And the first story we did was exactly around this dilemma that when you want to do a remodel, it's really hard to envision the change. It's hard to communicate that change. And so what came back from our first science fiction panel, and we've applied it many times, but what came back was using this augmented and virtual reality to envision what a remodel could be. And this is a process, by the way, I know not all of us have access to science fiction writers, right? But this is a process you can apply in your own life. I personally have sat down and have written small paragraph stories about what my life could look like in 5 years. And that's a really powerful exercise. Do that. And if you have somebody who cares about you enough to maybe, indulge you for a moment, say, would you write 3 one-paragraph stories about what you think my life could look like in 5 or 10 years? And that is a rare, eye-opening exercise we almost never engage in. And for me personally, it led to some insights. I mean, I'm the author of the book, but it's led me in some new directions. And we do the same things for company. And then once we have a vision of what that future could be, the next step we do is to try to embed that in a narrative. I use the word narrative because story is a little too overused in the world of business. We say story, but we're really talking about the chronology, events. And we're talking about narrative where you have character and a conflict and a resolution. Because why? Narratives are one of our oldest human tools. We have baked into our brains. There's incredible neuroscience showing that when we hear a story, our brains actually change. And our brains align with the storyteller in the process of listening to a story. So we use science fiction writers to imagine what the future could be, to imagine our best possibilities. And then we use these narratives to create a story that allows us to suspend our disbelief. And so, for example, when we applied this at Lowe's, what it helped the executives do is to move from that place of skepticism where they say, well, we couldn't do that, or we're just a do-it-yourself retailer, to instead suspending their disbelief and saying, hey, we got to be a part of this. We got to take advantage of this. And so moving into that space of seeing what's possible and taking action. And I guess I'll just say, when we tell the story, I will confess that we like to do it in a creative way. So we often like to use comics to tell the story. And why comics? Because we're so tired of PowerPoint, right? We're beat to death by PowerPoint. But comics kind of moves people into a space that's a little less evaluative and a little more like curious.
Now, Nathan, if I remember, too, and when you say, by the way, science fiction, it's not just the term. You actually brought in and talked to and had them working for you real professional science fiction writers. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Real science fiction writers. I mean, these are people who, in their full-time, career are trying to write stories. We had the real deal in. And see, I love science fiction writers because if you really get down to it, they try to imagine the future in terms of its implications for people. And that's really what we're trying to do. When we work with organizations, we're trying to help organizations think really deeply about their customers. So it's not, I opened telling about Lowe's and all this fanciful technology, but at the end of the day, it's not about technology. It's about people, it's about customers, and it's about change.
Nathan, we want to find out more about this, but at this point in the show, we want to remind our listeners that you're listening to The Secrets of Success. My name is Bill Horan. The show is produced at the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. We'll be right back after this brief intermission.
Well, Jason, I've got to tell you, you're pretty much everything this company is looking for in an entry-level candidate.
Great.
Your resume isn't quite what we're used to, but you've got a fantastic work ethic.
Thank you.
And I'm impressed by how you carry yourself.
So, should we talk about the job?
What? The job? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I have no way of recruiting or even meeting you. This interview didn't happen.
It may sound ridiculous, and that's because it kind of is. There's a huge pool of talent your company is missing out on. Meet the grads of life. Who are they? Talent worth knowing about. Young adults of unique determination and experience. An ideal fit for your company in an entry-level position, internship, or even mentorship. They might not have every qualification you typically look for, but they're exactly who your company needs.
Man, we really could have used him.
Don't miss out on a resource many innovative companies have already discovered. Go to gradsoflife.org to learn how to find, cultivate, and train this great pool of untapped talent. Brought to you by the Ad Council and gradsoflife.org.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Secrets of Success. I'm your host, Bill Horan, and today we're speaking with Nathan Furr, author of Leading Transformation. Now, Nathan, just to sum up, if someone didn't hear the first part of the show, you were working with Lowe's. You've developed a program using virtual reality and augmented reality, actually hiring science fiction writers and putting their work into comic books to move Lowe's into the future. And then you got the opportunity of, and I'm taking from your book, so you tell me if I'm correct, to show it to the big bosses of Lowe's and the executives. And when they got it, what happened?
Well, you can imagine handing out a comic book to your boss, particularly if your boss is an accountant. Now, we love all you accountants out there, but you don't exactly have the reputation as being the most humorous of them. And so handing out a comic book to your CEO is certainly a terrifying event. So in this case, it was my co-author, Kyle Nell, who was head of innovation labs at Lowe's, who handed out the comic book. And there was one point where some people were even laughing at him. But when they read the story, the tone in the room completely changed. And people started nodding their heads. They started to say, wow, we should start thinking about this. And for those people who are listening, what we're really trying to do is, it sounds very fanciful with science fiction and augmented reality and all that. But all we are trying to do is help Lowe's, and we've done this with other companies like help Pepsi and others, to imagine what more is possible for their organization and then make some meaningful progress towards it. So science fiction writers helped us imagine it. The comic books they're a vehicle of the story. And by the way, we've done other formats as well. So we've done rap battles to help sustainable development entrepreneurs communicate their message. You can be really creative with this, but ultimately it's about telling the story in an impactful way so that people start saying, yeah, we can do this. How do we take the next step?
Now, something else that amazed me, too, using neuroscience, if I read this correctly, you, through virtual reality, someone could be looking at, let's say, a new design for their living room or bedroom or something. And even if they said they didn't like it, you could tell because of their brain waves, they actually have a different heat or temperature to them. So you knew that they liked it. Did I read that correctly?
Yeah.
That's really so futuristic. We don't even think we're close to that. And you're doing it. It's already since it's in your book, it's part of history.
Yeah. No, it's true. So my other co-author, Thomas Ramsaway, he's one of the leading applied neuroscientists. And so what we did is we used these high-resolution EEG headsets. They're like a little headset sits in your head. It's like a baseball cap. And it allows us to look into your mind and really look at your reactions to sort out how overloaded is your mind, what are your emotional reactions, what are your rational reactions, and to see what's really going on. And by the way, I don't want to get too sciencey here, but one of the beauties of applied neuroscience is it can actually sort out what you are going to decide before you know you're going to decide it. And we use this, again, it sounds very fancy, but what's underneath it? I want to emphasize that it's just the applied neuroscience is one of many tools to overcome one of the big barriers to change. And that is, remember I talked about one of the big barriers to change is fear of the unknown. If you're going to go into the unknown, you're going to have a lot of skeptics, a lot of critics, and you yourself are going to doubt. And so you need some guideposts. You need some markers that you're going the right direction, both to convince yourself and guide you and to convince your skeptics. And so in the book, we talk about creating KPIs of the future. These are different than...
Excuse me, what's a KPI?
KPI is a key performance indicator. So in a lot of big companies, they talk about these key performance indicators, and they're looking at, profit, or they're looking at market share growth. And those are mature measures of performance. We're looking at how do you create a measure of the direction you're heading. And we talk about using experimental design, which just means being really thoughtful about how are you going to get a reliable measure. And applied neuroscience is just one of the tools that we use among many to try to get some guidance that you're heading the right direction. So when we used applied neuroscience, we would, for example, test out the story with people. So while people are reading the story, we'd see what are their reactions, and we could see where they were getting stuck. Or when we were testing a prototype, for example, when we were testing the augmented reality and the virtual reality prototypes, we saw something really important, and that was that when people have a headset on and they're immersed in this virtual world, it actually tends to overwhelm their brains. Their brains like overheat. Versus when they're using augmented reality, say you're holding a phone, pointing at a room, and it's superimposing a digital object onto that room, then it's a lot easier on your brain. And so that helped guide the development of that particular project to help us say, you know what, let's lay off the virtual reality and let's head more in the direction of that augmented reality. And those insights, not only did they feed Lowe's development, but they also actually had a big impact on Google and their shift to emphasize augmented reality over virtual reality.
Now, Nathan, once again, we want to remind our audience, if they're hearing all this good stuff and they're saying, who is this? Who am I listening to? It's Nathan Furr, F-U-R-R. He's one of the authors of the book, Leading Transformation. Nathan, where can we get the book? And is there a website we should know about?
Yeah, so the website is called leadingtransformationbook.com. So just remember, it's Leading Transformation, and it's a book. So, and then I think you'll get your best price at Amazon.com. That's what I would recommend.
And for anybody who's enjoying this, you're listening to the show on The Secrets of Success on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College. And if you're listening, and of course you are, you can also go to nccradio.org and look for the podcast of the show. Go to Secrets of Success and then go to Leading Transformation. So if you missed part of the show or you want to tell someone about this and they say, you're crazy, this is futuristic, you must have been watching a movie or it's a dream. No, this is real. And you can certainly be on the cutting edge. You can amaze some of your friends with this. And also, perhaps some of your bosses, maybe the business isn't doing as well as you think it is. They may want to get into something like this and more or less protect your future. One of the neat things you say in your book, Nathan, you create the future, not just let it happen. And I think for all of us, that might be a good personal motto. Are we just letting things happen and reacting, like watching the wave come in and then jumping over it? Or are we creating something ourselves, and you give us that opportunity? Now, you mentioned that narrow thinking limits us. How do you break the people out of this narrow thinking, though? Because I'm going to tell you for sure, all the things you talked about, narrow thinking, fear and habits, you're describing me. And I'd be the guy who says, let's not get too wild with the comic books and the science fiction. So how do you break us out of it?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. So there's really three process steps in the book. The first is using science fiction and story to envision what's possible. The second is what you've highlighted, which is breaking the decision bottlenecks. And we talk about using archetypes to do that. And then third, we've already talked about, which is using these key performance indicators, these future key performance indicators to guide your path as you move into the unknown. But if you're in an organizational setting, you hit the nail on the head. And actually, even individuals, our habits, routines, politics hold us back. So one of the big things we know everybody's going to bump up against, even if you can come up with a great story, you got to come up against all the naysayers in the organization. And listen, there's no magic wand we can wave to make them all go away. But it really comes down to, we actually go back to some of the old psychological science that looked at what are the archetypes that define the roles people play, and how do we understand people through that role they play and their incentives, not our incentives for them, but their incentives, what drives them. Let me give you an example to make this really concrete. Think about, you're a do-it-yourself retailer, and we want to, one of the projects that we did was to say, one of my co-authors was pushing was, you could bring a part into a store, you could scan it, and then you could 3D print that part. Think about all the legal liability involved in that. Like, what if you scan a part that somebody has a patent on? What if you scan a part and print it and it breaks and it hurts the person? I mean, this is a legal nightmare. So, of course, the legal department was like super opposed to this. And we just couldn't move forward until we said, well, what's the archetype of the legal department? They're what we would call the caretaker archetype. They see their job as to take care of this organization and protect it from harm. So what we had to do is we had to figure out, okay, if that's what they see their role as, and what their incentives are, how do we speak to them in a language they can understand? And what we did is we went back to them and we said, listen, we appreciate what you do to protect this organization, but we're facing a lot of change here in the future. And if we're not able to do anything new, this organization is going to die. So how do we take care of the organization and work together to try new things while keeping it safe? And that language, that shift, it just, all the shackles fell off and people started to say, oh, well, we could do this or we could do that, and start to line up. And so it's really recognizing that so much of habit drives our behavior, and getting into the incentives that we can leverage. And sometimes we like this in the book, we talk about using the organization's proclivities against it. So the proclivity for data, the proclivity, associated with a particular archetype. And I don't want this to sound overly complex. Let me boil it down to this. It's about saying what really drives a behavior and how do we directly tackle that motivation.
Nathan, really, it's been so interesting, and I urge anybody listening to the show, the book is Leading Transformation by our guest, Nathan Furr, F-U-R-R. Nathan, give us the website again, please.
It's leadingtransformationbooks.com.
And if you want to be the coolest person in your group, you want to be the go-to person because you know the future, you know what's going on already, get hold of the book, Leading Transformation. Start to amaze your coworkers and friends, and at first they'll probably think you're crazy, but then they'll be coming to you for advice and saying, well, how could we use that, and where did you find out about this? And then you'll say, I listened to The Secrets of Success, and I read Leading Transformation. So you can be the leader of your pack just by getting hold of Nathan's book. Nathan, thanks so much for being with us today. We'd like to remind our audience that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we'll continue our journey to success.